we are going to be addressing an issue of anti-Semitism in healthcare. We have been seeing this issue since essentially October 8th, 2023. It was sort of a volcanic eruption of anti-Semitism, often, as we say, masked as anti-Zionism in the healthcare space. And we're talking about physicians, nurses, doctors, physical therapists, clinical social workers, everyone who works in healthcare, public health. We even see it in the veterinary space. So we're seeing it across the board in the healthcare community. We are seeing it in every relationship in healthcare, from provider to provider, provider to patient, patient to provider, medical student to medical student, or nursing student to nursing student, and then between faculty and students, both directions. We've been seeing it across the board in a variety, as I said, relationships and a variety of manifestations. We're also seeing patterns that are happening in our medical associations, in our medical association conferences, and all kinds of speaker events being held at various institutions, from universities to hospitals to, again, various types of medical conferences. The patterns show us that there's something intentional and planned and strategic about it. And we know that there's more to it, right, behind the scenes. We also are seeing this in a field where it's unexpected by most people, and it's particularly disturbing. This is because, first of all, every element of society interacts with the healthcare community. It's because it's a field where you expect humanism and human care, and it doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter where your background is. We know that Israeli hospitals have people of all backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Jews, treating with compassion and excellence people of all backgrounds, and we should be able to do the same here in the United States and around the world. We also know that this is particularly problematic because the healthcare community is an industry that requires an enormous amount of trust. And when that trust begins to be eroded, we've got a problem. And then finally, history has shown us that when the medical community adopts an ideology, society follows that. And so we have to be particularly concerned about seeing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the healthcare community. I just want to quickly introduce AJMA to those people who aren't familiar with it. The American Jewish Medical Association is a new organization. It was founded in the wake of October 8th, 2023. And surprisingly, there was no version of AJMA before that. So we joined together in an empowered community, creating an empowered community of people looking to fight anti-Semitism and seek excellence and merit in healthcare. So the American Jewish Medical Association is a membership model, and I do welcome everyone here to join the AJMA. Even if you're not in healthcare, we have a category for Friends of AJMA, but we have categories for every single healthcare profession and students and people even in healthcare administration. So I really do urge you to join the AJMA. You can do it now during the webinar. You can do it afterwards by going to our website. This QR code will take you to our join page. And if you have any questions about it, I welcome you to email me afterwards. I'll be putting my email in the chat. Yair will be putting the website in the chat. And again, welcome to the American Jewish Medical Association. Yael?
Great, thank you for the introduction. And it's my distinct pleasure. It's with tremendous excitement. I've been looking forward to this conversation with Einat Wilf. For many of you, and we have so many people on the chat right now because her name is so well known. She has an amazing clarity in viewing the situation and really speaks to many of the issues that we're finding at our universities, which have, of course, unfortunately made their way into the healthcare environment as well. Einat speaks from a very educated position. She carries multiple degrees. First of all, her English is outstanding because of her youth spent briefly in the U.S., but as well as her degrees, she has both an MBA from France. She also has a PhD from Wilson College at Cambridge, and of course a degree from Harvard as well. She was a visiting professor at Georgetown, where she actually made, I think, one of the most outstanding series. You could look at it on YouTube. And from a personal position, having grown up in the labor Zionist camp, in growing up in Jerusalem, like many of us in medicine, we often find many of us who are on this Zoom today come from a more liberal defined background. And what we're seeing amongst many of our colleagues, there is a more left-wing ideology, particularly in medicine. And I can speak to that, but I can speak to it from a very educated position, where she also served as a member of the Knesset. From 2009 to 2013, she also was a consultant for McKinsey, but was working with the government at a time where they were really trying to solve the issue and come to a peaceful agreement with the Palestinian people to find a way forward. And so much of what we need to find now is the voice. We are all looking at the trees and fighting every single little issue. And what I so appreciate with Einat is her ability to kind of say, stop arguing the trees. You are getting lost. You need to see the bigger vision. You need to see the forest. And what language we use and how we define and see the issue with moral clarity is why I so appreciate her voice. So I want to say a tremendous respectful welcome to Einat. And I look forward to defining some of these terms so you can really help guide us, because we are all feeling an existential angst to view things in a way that is a bit global and a larger telescoped out view. And then what I would love to do is to really relate it to medicine. In your book, and you have several outstanding books, but in particular, there was and it reflects to the New York Times today, in War of Return, where you really discuss what I hope you'll explain to the whole audience about Palestinianism and what is truly the root of the issue to why we can't have peace right now. In that first chapter, you actually talk about the War of Independence, and there was a convoy of buses going into Jerusalem to the Mount Scopus campus, and it was entirely doctors and professors and complete humanitarians, and they were ambushed and murdered. And we see this, I couldn't help but think of that as we see the cover of the New York Times today, where it is accusing Israel of murdering 15 emergency responders. So Einat, welcome. And I would, and the entire audience would really love to hear your clarity of vision in really understanding what Zionism is, and many of your other fantastic terms, which help us so much with clear vision: Palestinianism and the placard strategy.
Certainly, and thank you so much for this. So first of all, I'll start with what Zionism is. I have a colleague, Dr. Shani Moore. I recommend reading his stuff. Many years ago, he told me Zionism is normal, anti-Zionism is insane. And so Zionism is basically the political movement for self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. And every part of this phrase is important. It's a political movement in the sense that it's an actual movement with a goal. You know, sometimes I see Jewish organizations say things like Zionism is a 3,000-year-old movement. And I'm like, look, undoubtedly, and it's important, the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is millennia old. In fact, you know, there's a great new book by Ben Freeman, The Jews and Indigenous People. And he makes a really important point that even according to the UN legal definition of what it means to be indigenous is not to just live in a place for many years, not even centuries. That doesn't make you indigenous. To be indigenous is to have your entire culture, language, calendar, words, terms, rituals connected with a place. And in that sense, the Jews are the indigenous people. You know, everything from the language to the calendar. I always like to tell people, you know, the Jews maintained the Hebrew calendar, which is an agricultural calendar connected to the climate of the land of Israel. They maintained it in Poland. Made no sense there. but they maintained it because their whole culture, sense of being, was to be the indigenous people of the land of Israel, and they kept it even when they were not physically there. Again, to be indigenous, you don't have to be physically in a place, but your culture has to be connected to that place. So when people say that Zionism is a 3,000-year-old movement, the connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel is indeed millennia old, unbroken, consistent, and the Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. But Zionism is a political movement that emerges against a specific background of the rise of the nation state. So it's a political movement of the Jewish people. And again, this is really important because people try to pretend that Judaism is only a religion. I have a talk which I give to people about what it means to be the Jewish state. In the talk, I always mention to people that I'm a devout atheist. And the reason that I've come to mention it is that I realize that I can talk for a whole hour. I'll go through the entire history of the Jewish people, what it means to be an a people, and people will leave the talk and they'll be like, yeah, this is a religion. So only by telling them that I'm very Jewish and very atheist do I force people to begin to contend with the fact that the Jews are first and foremost a people, an Uh, again, Dara Horn said in a beautiful talk, she said, people try to pin us down. Are we a nation, a people, an ethnicity, a race, a religion? And she was like, we predate the boxes. We have our own term, one word, one syllable, two letters, We are Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. The best way to understand it, as she says, is as a joinable tribe. We're a tribe, but you can join. But again, it's for the Jewish people. It's not a religious idea. It's for self-determination and liberation. Against Zionism is a movement of self-determination, liberation, not different than all other movements of national liberation and self-determination. That's why my colleague Shani Moore says it's normal. And as I said, in their ancestral homeland, because once you understand that the Jews are a people, once you understand that the governing political organization after the fall of empires is the rise of the states, and especially the nation states, then the Jews have the right to self-determination, and the only land to which the Jewish people were ever collectively connected is the land of Israel. So this is Zionism. Now, in terms of why, so I hope I briefly made the case why Zionism is normal, again, a movement of national self-determination in an ancestral indigenous homeland. Why is anti-Zionism insane? Because anti-Zionism is not just some kind of opposition to Jewish sovereignty. That is kind of nominally the definition. But anti-Zionism is actually the respectable mask behind which an assault on Jewish life takes place. And before I'll go through the steps by which this assault takes place, I want to say something of why you're encountering it in your profession. For many years, I struggled with, sometimes you have emotions and you're not yet able to explain them. So I struggled to explain to myself why I am emotionally more distressed by the rise of anti-Zionism in the left, among, progressive so-called liberal circles, the educated class, but not so much in those kind of the areas of the right, the extreme right. And I struggled because objectively anti-Semitism on the right is lethal. It led to a few attacks in the last few years. And I thought, okay, what's going on? And then at one point I was able to define it to myself. I thought that anti-Semitism on the right is akin to crime. So crime is a threat. Crime can be lethal, but you recognize crime generally as an external threat. I would venture to say that I guess that most of your friends are not criminals. This is not your social circle. So you know that it's a threat. It can be lethal, but you recognize it as something external against which you build barriers. You have kind of things that alert you to the threat, but by and large, it's an external threat. Anti-Zionism is more like domestic violence. It feels like it basically assaults you in the place that you were supposed to feel safe. It assaults you at home. It assaults you under the respectable mask of your spouse, the person you're supposed to trust. And this is what anti-Zionism is. Anti-Zionism is able to mount an effective assault on Jewish life in the place where Jews are. And that's why it's so effective and so dangerous. Because again, I think most Jews are not members of the KKK. They do not spend their time in kind of extreme right-wing circles, but they are very much disproportionately represented in academia, in journalism, in medicine. And this is where you see the assault take place. So the reason you're seeing it is that that's where Jews are. And that's why you're seeing it. So a bit about why this assault is so effective and how it takes place. So the main mechanism by which the assault takes place is something that I've come to call the placard strategy. You mentioned it, because you see it most clearly in placards and anti-Israel demonstrations. And the placards are simple and ingenious. They are built like equations. One side of the equation says Israel, Zionism. Sometimes they'll just draw a Star of David. Then there's an equation sign. And the placard strategy has been so successful that I doubt any of you have seen a placard that said Zionism, equation sign, the political movement for self-determination and liberation of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. That would be the only precise placard, a long one, I agree, but it would be the only correct one. The placard strategy has been so successful that even people who love Israel know what's on the other side of this equation. Israel, Zionism, Star of David, equation sign, imperialism, racism, apartheid, and then it escalates, ethnic cleansing, Nazism, genocide, Holocaust. If you're in America in 2020, it will say white supremacy. And this really gives you a clue to how the placard strategy works. The words that are chosen to be on the other side of the equation sign don't reflect reality. I think you need to be 1 minute in Israel to know that. And in fact, they're not about Israel. If anything, the words are the inversion of reality. Zionism is the greatest decolonial project of being against imperialism, of rescuing Jews, let's say, from apartheid and lower class status in many countries, certainly in the Arab world. It's definitely the opposite of white supremacy. So this is typically the inversion of reality. But the reason that all these words are chosen is that by now they have become universally synonymous with evil. So this is why in 2020, when white supremacy became the word of evil, then it was immediately slapped next to Zionism, again, in a way that is completely devoid of any kind of reality, exactly of any context, pretty much the opposite. But because it was a moment where everyone agreed that white supremacy is evil, if anything, the greatest evil at that moment in America, then the logical way that the placard strategy works is that you put it next to Zionism. And the reason I know this is that, for example, the Zionism is Racism resolution that was passed in the UN General Assembly in 1975 is literally a placard strategy. It's one of the shortest resolutions of the UN General Assembly, basically said we are hereby resolved that Zionism is a form of racism. Why? Did they spend years researching and they said, okay, the UN has to acknowledge it? No. What happened is that sometime earlier, the UN General Assembly agreed to fight racism. So the nations were united around the idea that racism is bad. So as soon as you agree that racism is bad, step 2, slap it next to Zionism. And this is the other part of the placard strategy, that it's not just on placards. It's repeated everywhere. Media, social media. You can give an anti-Israel speaker 30 seconds on television for years. No matter what's the question, no matter what's happening at the moment, they will manage to say apartheid, racism, genocide in the answer. And you see it. I once had a friend, a diplomat who's not Jewish. I briefed him a few years ago about the placard strategy. It was before October 7th. He came back to me. He said, Einat, once you see it, you can't unsee it because it's everywhere. So it's not just 360 everywhere, social media, media. What makes it particularly dangerous is that it gets laundered through the most hallowed institutions. It gets laundered through academia. It gets laundered through so-called human rights organizations. It gets laundered through international institutions. So this strategy, which was in many ways created by the Soviet Union in the wake of World War II, sometimes I joke that Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union don't get enough credit for their contribution to taking Jew hate global, right? They literally wrote the book. Tsarist Russia wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And again, we might not think much of a book at this moment, but 120 years ago, publishing a book was a big deal. So imagine that you know, 120 years ago, all these libels, everything appeared in a book. A book was serious. And there's a reason why the Protocols has never been out of print, is available in every language in the world. In the Arabic world, they don't consider it a forgery. They consider it a serious book. I have another friend who's a diplomat who said that they received it when they were a diplomat in an Arab country by an Arab official as a kind of, this is how you know what's going on in the world. And after World War II, when anti-Semitism of the Tsarist Russia kind obviously became discredited, the Soviet Union got busy creating anti-Zionism and the placard strategy as its replacement and giving it academic prestige and beginning to launder it through the UN bodies as soon as the rise of many countries in the UN allowed the Soviet Union and the Muslim countries to pretty much pass through the UN General Assembly anything they want. There's this great phrase by Israel's legendary ambassador to the UN, Abba Eban, who said, as he was witnessing this process taking place, he said, if Algeria, it's always Algeria, if Algeria promoted a resolution to the UN General Assembly that the earth is flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by kind of 136 votes in favor, 13 against, and 26 abstentions. And those are pretty much still the numbers. So there became a point where you could launder everything through the UN. The UN amazingly still retains this kind of hallowed idea, even though it shouldn't. And as a result, a lot of things get laundered through the international institutions, through academia, right? You will get a PhD in Zionism as colonialism. You'll get tenured for Israel's an apartheid state. And recently I saw this briefing by a former Soviet operative who explained how you manipulate masses. He talked about repetition. He talked about strong visuals. The placards are very strong visuals. He talked about feelings. And what I found most important is that he spoke about prestige. And he said the following phrase. He said, prestige paralyzes judgment. And when I heard that, I thought, bingo. Because for years I talked about respectability and why respectability is important, but he said it so well. Prestige paralyzes judgment. So as a result, you could have doctors, highly educated people, academics. Oh, but the UN said it. Harvard said it. Columbia said it. The International Court of Justice said it. And nobody knows the inner workings of these bodies. There's an organization called the UN Human Rights Council. and you hear those 5 words, United Nations Human Rights Council, and you're thinking, oh, this must be a conclave of elderly men and women concerned with improving the world. You don't think Iran, Libya, Qatar, but that's the UN Human Rights Council, and all they do all day is obsess about Israel. But nobody knows that. So you see a report by the UN Human Rights Council and you think that must be serious. Prestige paralyzes judgment. So this is how the assault takes place during using the placard strategy. And this is where it leads. People are surrounded by a 360 environment, including some of its most prestigious institutions, that tells them essentially Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. This refrain. Now, you're a good person. You're a doctor. You're a nurse. You believe that you are here to do good in this world. This is your entire sense of yourself. Now, what greater good is there than to eradicate evil? Mm-hmm. And after October 7th, a new placard appeared. And because I follow it closely, I see the placards as they appear and change. And it said, keep the world clean. And you reminded me that one of the women who were holding the sign was a medical student in Poland, I think you said, or Sweden. And when I saw keep the world clean, I was like, okay, we are reaching the culmination of the placard strategy. Because if you are going to be exposed for decades to the idea that Israel, Zionism, Star of David is evil, then you will want to keep the world clean of that evil. You will want to eradicate this evil. And the greatest failure of Holocaust education is that people might know so much about Nazism and the death camps and anti-Semitism. Very few will be able to say one simple sentence, that everything the Nazis did was downstream from that idea, keep the world clean. In their case, racially clean, in today's world, a utopia of human rights clean. But the notion that there is a utopia out there, and what stands between us and utopia is the collective Jew, is one of the most ancient, and certainly when it comes to Jews, the most dangerous idea out there. And this idea is what's being now gaining kind of global currency. And like you're seeing it assaults the Jews in the place where Jews are. So this is why I take this very, very seriously.
So I feel like, Einat, you must have looked at my list of questions in my mind because you answered so many of them, and I appreciate that. The AJMA was founded very much in response to all of this kind of messaging in the healthcare space, and we want to push back and fight it. So what do you say is the best strategy to fight the placard strategy?
So a few years ago, an Italian programmer by the name of Brandolini, he kind of watched the discourse on the internet, and he coined the Brandolini principle, which also got the name of the bullshit asymmetry principle, which he basically said that the amount of effort required to refute bullshit is at least an order of magnitude than that required to create it. And I remember when I saw that, and I thought, oh my God, this is the Jewish condition. We are assaulted with, apartheid, racism, genocide, and then we need to spend books, essays, lectures to begin to unpack and to show, but we are the ones that are expending all this effort. Sartre said it once. He said, do not think that the anti-Semite doesn't know what they're accusing you of. They just know that the Jew cares for words and they want to see the Jews, essentially, he described it, holding their empty pockets out to essentially to see the Jews constantly working at justifying themselves. So my general recommendation is to not address every one of these accusations because they're not good faith accusations, even if the people who are saying them believe they are. And it's important to say here, this is not about individuals. At one point, I wanted to look at what happens when anti-Zionism really is allowed to run its full course. And I looked at, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Poland after 68, the Arab world in the 40s and 50s, places that said officially that we have nothing against Jews, we love Jews, we're only against Zionism. I looked at places that said that. Because, a lot of people today say, well, we're not anti-Semitic, and they think of anti-Semitism like Nazi Germany. They don't recognize anti-Zionism as its respectable replacement. That's why the Soviet Union has been so successful, and that's why it's been so ingenious. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to look at what happens practically. And every place where anti-Zionism became institutionalized as the state policy, two things happened. Step one, the environment turned hostile to Jewish life. Even as the anti-Zionists were saying, we have nothing against Jews, we love Jews, they might be Jews themselves. Doesn't matter. A lot of Jews in Iraq and Egypt, the legislation in Iraq and Egypt was against Zionism and against Zionists. It was never about Jews. And a lot of Jews thought they were exempt. They were like, oh, we're communists. We're not Zionists. We don't even care about this stuff. But then they were charged with Zionism. And no Jew will ever be able to avoid the charge of Zionism because, heaven forbid, they just celebrated Passover and they said next year in Jerusalem, or they just married and promised not to forget Zion. And that's it. And the environment turned hostile to Jewish life, and ultimately no Jews were left. So this is how anti-Zionism progresses. So I tell people, it doesn't matter what you individually believe. You might genuinely believe that you're a good person seeking to merely eradicate evil. You might genuinely believe that you're only an anti-Zionist, not against Jews. Jews are some of your best friends. You might genuinely believe it. You might be Jewish yourself. It actually doesn't matter because you're playing with fire. Everywhere that anti-Zionism was allowed to go unchecked, no Jews were left. That's it. And it doesn't matter what you believe, and it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. This is the playbook. I recently tweeted that it's no coincidence that many of the people who are very active in fighting anti-Zionism in the West have come to the West, to Canada, to the US, from Iran, from the Arab world, from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And the reason is that they have, as they say, the lived experience, one generation, at most 2 generations back, of how this playbook of we're not against Jews, we're only anti-Zionist, actually played. They saw the playbook in real time, and they saw that their families couldn't stay, not in the Soviet Union, not in Eastern Europe, not in the Arab world, not in Iran. Iran still claims to love Jews, have nothing against Jews, only against anti-Zionists, but the Jewish community of Iran is mostly in LA. So that's basically how the playbook works. And it really is not about the individuals. Wherever it's allowed free reign, that's how it ends. And for me, therefore, the most effective way of countering it is to talk about that. I will say something on this because it's very relevant to your profession. When I spoke with, when students, told me, how do we speak to university administrators? I told them, again, don't engage with them in the kind of in the weeds discussion of whether anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism. And I was like, don't do that. Just let them know that regardless of what their personal views and opinions are, everywhere that anti-Zionism was allowed to be institutionalized, no Jews were left. And is that what you want for your campus? Now, some students came back to me and said, this was highly effective. Some students came back to me and said, I think that's what they want. And I sometimes bring the example of Poland in 1968 because it's a little known example, but a very powerful one. So not a lot of people know that some Jews remained in Poland after World War II, believing in the promise of the socialist, brotherly utopia that will rebuild Poland after World War II as a place of brotherly affection and solidarity. So they rebuild themselves, believing in the promise of kind of communism and socialism. Then in 1968, a wave is inspired by the Soviet Union, a wave of anti-Zionism sweeps Eastern Europe and Poland. And Jews in positions of coveted prestige, such as doctors, academics, are removed from their positions. Some of them left, immigrated Poland, and some of them committed suicide. Unable to essentially deal with this second betrayal. So I have to say, we also need to contend with the possibility that anti-Zionism, precisely because it's an assault on Jewish life where Jews are, is interested in ensuring that there are not so many Jewish doctors and not so many Jewish professors, and kind of removing them from those positions to so-called free them for other people. So we need to actually leave room for the possibility that some people are actually interested in the effect of anti-Zionism of pushing Jewish professionals to the margins.
Well, you hit that one right on, you hit that nail on the head, because that is indeed, and I'm sorry to say this, because that is indeed, unfortunately, what we are seeing in medical schools, and whether it is, and in our nursing professions and our healthcare professions, is that there is a diminishment, be it students are going into other fields, but we are seeing many instances anecdotally, and the numbers are bearing it throughout, that we are seeing a decrease in the representation of Jews in healthcare. It's traditionally been a very popular, one could use the words overrepresented field for Jews in medicine and science. And exactly as you were saying, and when we look at, you were talking, and very much what's going on is a continuation of the Soviet propaganda. It's also the same concept that Goebbels had, is if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes truth. And what I think is just so fundamentally frightening, and what pushes me to have this very frightening second full-time job, despite being a surgeon, is that when it is the model that we have from the Nazi model, which as you pointed out many times, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and Hitler weren't just, tea buddies. They actually had collusion, and what we're seeing is a lot of the similar playbook. Exactly as you said with universities, we saw it in medicine as well. The University of Vienna, the early members of the Nazi Party, in greater numbers than any other profession, the doctors and the nurses joined the Nazi Party. And unfortunately, the consequence that we fear the most is when you have the dehumanization of the collective evil that is the Jew, be it because they are a disease onto the German body, or because they are now the representation of whatever the current collective evil is you're having dehumanization. But when it's in medicine and it's occurring globally, then the fear is the ultimate solution that was used against the Jews. So you frequently made the comment that you think that now that any regime that has promoted anti-Zionism and been so intensely anti-Semitic wreaks its havoc and then kind of disappears, gets exterminated on its own. But you fear what it is happening, is Iran and its push and whoever is behind the Soviet Marxist, Islamist, anti-Zionist axis. Have we reached the peak of the damage, or is the damage yet to come? And when we see the Australian nurses saying, I'm going to send my Jewish patients to hell, When we see medical students in the US saying, I'm going to modify my Hippocratic oath to not treat those who don't agree with my social ideology, I think that's what is so intensely frightening. And it's exactly as you said. Some people, it's incredibly effective to say, anti-Zionism is bad for Jews. Just look at the historical example. And then, but in many instances, they do want us gone. So we have a couple. There's a lot of questions. I'll throw a couple at you. One from a respected colleague. Who is behind the Soviet Marxist, Islamist, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism? And I think that also will speak to how to combat it, again, from the greater picture, not just getting lost in the trees trying to fight each tiny example that's coming up.
So I can trace back the ideology, and I can show how the Soviets really crafted it as a respectable academic idea. And, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, when the Soviets created anti-Zionism as a respectable academic profession, what they did is, people got PhDs. This is the time where a lot, for example, of the Palestinian leadership gets their PhDs in the Soviet Union. That's what Abu Mazen got his PhD, in a form of Holocaust denial. And as you know, in academia, once you start referencing each other, it becomes this kind of impenetrable web of respectable cross references. And they export it to academia in the West through Marxist left-wing circles in the 70s and 80s. And from there, it went to the Anglo academia that always took its cue from the European, certainly in the kind of the social or the humanities. And that's where it flourishes today, even though the Soviet Union is long gone. The communists were part of bringing down the Shah in Iran, and they were thrilled. And they made common cause with the Islamists, thinking that they were fighting for a better world. And then the communists pretty much killed, tortured, put in jail, exiled, and then the Islamists took over. So you're seeing again and again this kind of coming together of kind of Soviet Marxist left-wing circles. Even again, Soviet Union no longer exists, but left-wing Marxist circles with Islamist circles, and where they really come together because they share no other value is in the notion that the world would be a better place without the collective Jew. So by now, in terms of who is behind it, it's, you could always trace some money and all that and various organizations. But at one point, it's just so powerful that people just use it. Someone recently compared anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism to the Ring. So I sat down, this is me doing research, I sat down to see the whole trilogy so that I'll understand what what the reference was. And there is a lot to it. The notion that it has immense power, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, when you're asking yourself at one point, but why? Why invest so much? Because it's incredibly powerful. By now, it's an idea, ideology, sentiment that is centuries, millennia old. It has like deep geological foundations that go to kind of the basis of both Western and Islamic civilization. And it's incredibly powerful. It allows you to create political alliances between people that, such as the communists and the Islamists in Iran, that otherwise would not be caught dead together. It's incredibly powerful, but like the Ring, it ultimately destroys its wearer. You correctly said every power that made anti-Zionism and in the last few decades, as a result, Palestinianism into its main cause, ultimately ended up in the dustbin of history. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Pan-Arabism. I'm guessing the Ayatollah regime is heading in that direction. Hopefully Qatar and Turkey later. But, there's not a lot of I don't take a lot of pleasure in saying that ultimately anti-Zionist, Palestinianist supporting regimes collapse, because like you said, the Jews suffer the brunt of the damage until they collapse. So yes, I could, if I didn't care about the Jews, this is what I would do. I would just sit back, eat popcorn, and see all these systems collapse onto themselves in this kind of insane spiral of anti-Zionism. But I care deeply about the Jews. And because the Jews suffer from a timing problem, by the time that the world wakes up to how terrible these ideologies are, we have suffered the brunt of the damage. So we need to understand that we operate in a world where we need to do both things at once. We need to take care of our own, which, by the way, I've been saying this a lot in the last year, and it's been a really difficult message because we have by now raised one, even maybe two generations of Jews who believe that being Jewish is taking care of everyone else. And even, you want to be a good ally. To be a Jew is to be a good ally. Your allies will betray you. You still want to be a good ally. The notion that Jews have a sense of solidarity and responsibility to each other is something that for a lot of younger Jews almost feels cringy, at best. And but no, this is a moment of great peril. This ideology is mounting, it's reaching its culmination, and we need to ensure that we don't suffer as much damage as, the least damage possible. But then we also need to reach out to allies and tell them, look at how this ends. There's no arc in which this ends well. Doesn't end well for Jews, but also doesn't end well for the society in the grips of this insanity. So stop it now while you can. Rise up in your professions, in the universities, in journalism, in your hospitals, and say, not here. And by the way, the simplest way to say not here, and I know for people this sounds harsh, but basically use the placard strategy as your key. Sometimes people tell me, how do I know criticism of Israel? And I'm like, it's actually really easy. Take the placard strategy words, anyone who uses them, that's it, beyond the pale. That's not a good faith discussion of what's going on. And this way you'll know what's going on.
Einat, what we are seeing very frequently and there is geographic variation. I can tell you there's a couple of campuses that have been particularly bad, is that we're seeing a number of Jews coming forward as anti-Zionist Jews. I've heard you speak very well at really the bullying that's occurring for students. For a lot of the young students are getting kind of bullied to not identify as fully as Jews and recognizing how important Central Zionism is to the Jewish religion. I think it gets more challenging when it's professors. Again, then you have that prestige concept. I think all of us would really love to know, what on earth is Ilan Papp, Noam Chomsky, Ross Siegel? What are these people thinking? What are they? Is it, you've talked a lot about sort of the awakening of the left in Israel, that they sort of didn't realize, at least the left in Israel. I'm assuming those are the journalists who write for 972 magazine and occasionally write op-eds in Haaretz, that, well, there's a differentiation. They don't like Israel because of the settlers and in Judea, Samaria, or West Bank, whichever terminology you're using for that. But they don't have a problem with Israel in and of itself. And now they're waking up, well, they have a problem with Israel, period. It's the only country that after 80 years is trying to still be asked the question of should it be allowed to exist. No other nation state has that. So, what are these? These are let's call them the grown-ups in the room. That you have these prestigious professors, grown-ups, making a living out of being anti-Zionists. Jews can be everything. We argue all different points. We have Karl Marx, who certainly was anti-Semitic. We have Rothschild, the other side of the perspective. What say you about these professors that are making our lives challenging?
So first, that there's nothing new about it. Some of the greatest enemies of the Jewish people have been essentially converts. When you look at the medieval debates, when the Jews they were slaughtered if they won, they were slaughtered if they lost. The, the the people that represented the Catholic Church on the other side of those medieval debates were always Jewish converts because they would attack the Jews from within their knowledge of the Jewish texts and history. Being Jewish is historically difficult, has a lot of, I think it also has a lot of great stuff, but there is sustained pressure in a variety of ways, sometimes nice, sometimes not so nice, to essentially sell out your people. And there will always be people who succumb to the pressures to not be Jewish and to the pressures to sell out your people, to the reward to sell out your people. Now, the more educated you are, the more degrees you have, the more articulate you are, the greater the rewards. And anti-Zionist Jews are incredibly valuable as a mask to continue the assault on Jewish life. That's why they're so valuable, because all you have to do is to bring forward the anti-Zionist Jew, and you can continue with your claim that we have nothing against Jews, we love Jews, we're only anti-Zionist. It is precisely because of this claim that I went to research what happens to Jews when anti-Zionism rises to be institutionalized, because it really didn't matter. There were communist Jews in Egypt and Iraq, very many. They were, they were just assimilated Jews. That's it. They thought it had nothing to do with them. In the Soviet Union, there were Jews who would say, no, the Soviet Union is not against Jews. It's only anti-Zionist. Everywhere you have Jews who succumb to those pressures and the rewards and sell out their people. The only way, in my view, to address it is to really say it's not about them. At the end of the day, they can be Jews, but this only ends in one way. And if they think they're going to be spared, they're not. But really, they are succumbing to those pressures. Pun intended, for the Jewish people, historically, this has been our cross to bear. There will always be Jews who will sell out their people for the great rewards that await on the other side. It is a permanent fixture of Jewish life. We need to understand, and again, keep ourselves focused on the forest rather than the trees. The forest is that it literally doesn't matter if Jews are making the claim, if non-Jews are saying that they love Jews. Anti-Zionism, whenever it becomes institutionalized, ends in one way and one way only. There's no other kind of example.
Thanks, Einat. You're always just so clear and enlightening. I want to ask you about another term that we see a lot and then connect that with a term you use a lot. We are seeing a new term, anti-Palestinian racism, emerging quite often, especially at least in our field. It's coming up in our medical associations, it's coming up in listservs and so on. And as you said, when you put those two together, you're basically saying, well, of course, racism's bad, right? You're tying this issue to a topic that is already agreed upon, right? Racism's bad. So I want you to address that term that has been developed. I'll just use that word. And then also tie it to your definition. For this audience, I think everyone needs to hear the definition of Palestinianism.
Yes. So over the years, as I've talked through the conflict and what is the conflict about, I kind of talk about through the process of realizing that Israel's kind of left wing's hope that the conflict was about land, partition, a Palestinian state, ultimately collapsed again and again in the face of multiple times when Palestinians, both the people and the leaders, walked away from clear, concrete opportunities to have their own state, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, and typically followed it up with intense violence. And I talk about how I go through the history, and I realize that to the credit of Palestinians, they have always told us that their ideology and identity is tied with the non-existence of a Jewish state. We just didn't want to listen, or when we listened, we thought it was so preposterous. We thought it was bluster or some negotiating position. But at one point, just all the evidence and all the data is certainly on that side. So I would argue the opposite. I would argue that anti-Palestinian racism is most expressed in a term that I've come to call West-plaining. West-plaining is a term I created, based on mansplaining, that it's when Western diplomats, journalists, people of that profile explain away what Palestinians clearly say. And that's where I actually see the racism, because Palestinians, to their credit, make it very clear that their entire ideology and identity is about no Jewish state. And then people explain it over them because it's kind of inconvenient. So over the years, I've come to call this singular obsession with the non-existence of a Jewish state Palestinianism. And I say that Palestinianism has 4 core tenets. From the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. And certainly since October 7th, I've been telling people, if you've ever thought the return was some soft nostalgia, return is October 7th. Return, you go back to our Palestinian texts in the 50s and 60s, they always imagine return as a triumphant invasion, a desecration of the Jewish body, will tear their hearts out of their body, their fingernails from their limbs. This is why you saw so much euphoria on October 7th. This is not just, Hamas, all of Gaza, the West Bank, Palestinians around the world, their collaborators around the world. It was not by, breaking for some open air prison. We know it's a lie. As soon as it was revealed, it was replaced by other lies. They were euphoric because they finally saw this vision of return being realized. And you don't know at how many panels I've participated since October 7th, where there was a Palestinian speaker and the Westerner tried to have them disavow Hamas. And they would say things like Hamas is part of the fabric of Palestinian society. And I would be there saying, look, Hamas is merely the executive arm of Palestinianism. It's not some group that came out of outer space and hijacked a people. They represent and operated on behalf of Palestinianism. And the Palestinians agree, but the Western moderator doesn't want that. So I think that's anti-Palestinian racism. When I recently, when there was this whitewashing commission about UNRWA, again, UNRWA is kind of this Palestinian organization that is the ideological backbone that funnels Western money and UN legitimacy to the Palestinian war against the Jewish state. And when it was revealed that people participated in the massacre, there was a need for a whitewashing commission. So I was invited to testify in front of the former French foreign minister who was heading that commission. And as I'm speaking, her mandate was to keep UNRWA neutral. And I begin by saying, look, UNRWA cannot be neutral because it's a Palestinian organization for the Palestinian goal of no Jewish state. So there's no neutrality here to be had in any way, shape, or form. And as I'm explaining, I see that she's making faces, her assistant's making faces. I stop. I say, look, I see you don't want to listen to me. So why don't you just listen to Palestinians? They're telling you that this is what UNRWA is. I showed them even a big sign outside a neighborhood near Bethlehem, misnamed a refugee camp. It's not a camp. No one there is a refugee, but it's misnamed that way. And the big sign says, UNRWA services are our right, look at the entitlement, until return. So the Palestinians are basically telling the West, you will pay for all the normal services that people typically pay in their society for themselves. You will pay for us, not until there's a state, not until there's an end of the occupation, not until a two-state solution, not until all the things that you imagine West planning are the goals of the Palestinians, but until return. And again, return is October 7th. So I told her, listen to Palestinians. They're telling you. And you know what her response was? They don't get to decide. Left me almost speechless. It was one of the most neo-colonial attitudes I ever met. So if you're talking about actual anti-Palestinian racism, this is it. It's the complete refusal and West-planning attitude that refuses to take Palestinians at their word. That's in terms of the actual, what's actual anti-Palestinian racism is all about. But I want to say one more thing about Palestinianism. I talked about, one of the messages I have is that this is actually not about Israel, which sounds very odd because supposedly all these placard strategy words are placed next to Israel, Zionism, Star of David. But it's not. As I said, it's the way that you mount an effective assault on Jewish life wherever Jews are. But in the same way that it's not about Israel, it's actually not about the Palestinians. So all the evil words are on the side of Israel, Zionism, Star of David. It's no coincidence that all the good words, freedom, equality, justice, rights, are on the side of Palestinianism, which is the negation of the collective Jew, the idea from the river to the sea, no Jewish state. It is the organization around the erasure of the collective Jew. So maybe some of you have wondered about feminists for Palestine, queers for Palestine. Palestine is fighting climate change. Palestine is worker rights. And you're looking at that and you think they're morons because, don't they know how queers or don't they know the situation of women or all that? But again, it's not about real people. Palestine has become essentially the new marker of the global utopia. Once you understand that, everything falls into place. Because once you understand that Palestine is just the short word for whatever I think is utopia, fighting climate change, queer rights, worker rights, then it makes sense. Then it actually has a logic to it. So if you really want to talk about anti-Palestinian racism, it is the absolute, complete refusal to listen to Palestinians and the making them into this abstract notion of utopia, of the world without the collective Jew, but it's not about the actual people.
Excellent. And, when you talk about the collective Jew and this whole utopic, that it's in medicine, we're supposed to, ideally, what we are supposed to be doing is treating each patient, whether you have a neo-Nazi in front of you, whether you have a racist in front of you, whether you have a saint in front of you, you are supposed to be using everything, all of your capabilities and knowledge to treat and make that patient better. Where we get into trouble, and what we saw in Nazi times, and we are seeing now, and we see that in there was a doctor's plot in the Soviet Union, is when you have a corruption of this medical idea of humanism, and instead of treating everyone, denying who you are as a practitioner and treating the individual patient, all of a sudden you're treating for social good. And that's exactly what you're speaking to. Is it's now Homo sapiens inability to deal with the contradictions and the somewhat futility of trying to have a perfect world. And who else to always scapegoat but the Jew? It's not only the collective evil, but we are the collective representation of the foibles of mankind. We have a bunch of really great questions, and I think they all kind of tie in together. One I'm gonna pose to you. They're talking about, and I'm speaking to this a bit as a personal question to you, as somebody who solidly puts themselves in the left or center left in Israel. who are our allies now? The left liberal organizations in Israel, it's okay. I mean, you're all still there, whether you like each other or not. But here we have a real issue because the climate change, the feminists, the pro-choice, are not welcoming spaces to Jews anymore. So who are our allies? And there are Muslim voices, but there's so few of them. And that goes to my bigger question, which is how are we going to get the clarity of your message, of our message, how we should be dealing with this, when there are literally only 15 million of us and there are 2 billion and 54 TikTok posts for every pro-Israel TikTok post. So 2 huge questions wrapped in there. What do we do with the disillusioned left, particularly here in the US, but globally? And our friends are silent, and we're not loud enough. We're amazing. Your voice is amazing, but we're speaking a little bit to the echo chamber. Yeah, in the next 5 minutes, if you could just
Sure.
answer that.
Oh, okay. First of all, we start with this. We need allies. We are indeed too small to do this on our own, even if we're all mobilized, even if we're all effective, and we're not, we're certainly much more than we were. We are still very small. And at the end of the day, we will need allies, and we will need allies who understand what's going on. Again, the best service we can do for them is not to explain why Israel's not an apartheid state. I mean, we can do that, but that's not the key issue. We need to let them know where all of this leads, how it builds, how it ends, how it destroys societies, how it means that they will have an America, a Canada, a Britain, a France, an Australia, let's say the top 5 countries outside of Israel where Jews live, where there are no Jews. And hopefully there will be enough people who are horrified by this prospect. Like I said, there may be some who might be delighted by this prospect, but we need to hope that there will be enough people who will be horrified by this prospect to rise up and say, not here, not here, not in America, not in Canada, not in those places. And like you said, also in the Arab world. Those are few and far between, but those are courageous voices that didn't exist in the past, who are saying also the Arab and Islamic world has benefited exactly 1 big zero from going against the Jews and being anti-Zionist. What Arab Muslim country has ever benefited, least of all, of course, the Palestinians, from making anti-Zionism an institutional ideology? It's only ever brought destruction. So, and we need to hope that there will be enough such allies that will rise up in time. But what I said, because there's no certainty in that, I also bring the message of we need to take care of our own, whatever that means. What you're doing here is part of it. Take our abilities, our skills, our times, our passion, our resources to our people right now. Right now, that's what's necessary. And as much as this message might grate on people who have been raised to believe that being Jewish is about taking care of everyone else, I'm sure by now everyone's heard Tikkun Olam starts, by the way, with the Jews if you want to fix the world. It's not about ignoring your people in favor of everyone else. But yes, I am by no means saying this is an assured process. I'm saying we need allies. The reason that I am semi-hopeful for countries like the US, Australia, Canada, France, Britain, is that, in the Dreyfus affair, France was split. We forget that there was the other half. There was the half that fought for Dreyfus, that ultimately got him acquitted. Britain, the US, Australia have a long history of philo-Semitism, of pro and proto-Zionism. There is an underlying element that can be enough for people to say, this is not the kind of America that we want. But am I concerned about, a vision of like an Islamist, woke, Marxist, AOC-led takeover of the Democratic Party? That's not an impossible scenario anymore. It's at least one that needs to be considered. And this also goes to the allies. the world that we had after World War II, that lasted a few decades, whereby we had ideological homes that were a perfect fit. You know, they shared all our values. That world is gone. And we need to mourn it and grieve it, but it's gone. So the allies that we're going to have are not necessarily going to share our values. You know, someone recently wrote about the last election in the US. She said, if you're voting your values, you're privileged. I'm voting survival. So it's the notion that we can now choose and have political homes that are just the perfect fit. That world is gone. And we need to now understand that we're going to have allies that sometimes don't share all our values, but they will guarantee our survival better than others. And that's the best I can say at this point. I know it's not great, but I think that's where we are.
I think you've referred to October 7th as a near-death experience. And when you have a near-death experience, you start just focusing on survival. So that makes
Yep.
sense. Yeah, Yael, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I want to first and foremost thank you, Einat. I told you I was a girl fan, and I think I proved that I quote you, and your clarity of mission and message. I know because there's so many, the chat has been very active. My phone has been going off, how much people have adored this conversation. And I know that many people will be listening again in the future. I thank you incredibly for the generosity of your time on behalf of Michelle and all of us at AJMA and all of our members and future members, and really look forward to talking with you more and maybe collaborating more on this, specifically on this topic, because we are in survival mode, and medicine is the last barrier.
Maybe if I can say just one more thing that I forgot.
Please.
One of the biggest challenges I've had over the years in describing and talking about anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century is that everyone is incredibly smug. Especially educated people believe that they would never fall for it. They would see it coming from, a mile, and they don't understand that they're falling for it as we speak, precisely to this, like, keep the world clean. So I just wanted to highlight that absolutely we are facing a problem where educated people are often the last to realize that they're falling for it, precisely because they believe their education protects them from that, and it doesn't.
That's 100% correct. That is absolutely what we are seeing, and it was the exact same. The Weimar Republic was one of the most liberal ideology, supportive, inclusive, progressive environments, and we saw how that quickly was manipulated and turned. And so whenever you have any social ideology taking over the practice of medicine, that is literally the death knell for the Jewish people and for actually a liberal Western value society. So absolutely, and why we all must raise our voices together. And I look forward to doing that more with you. And thank you incredibly for your time. And for everybody who is on and everybody who's listening, please join us to protect the future of medicine and healthcare and literally the survival of our people. And as I always add, and it may not be on a placard, but we understand it, is Am Yisrael Chai.
Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Einat.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all you do.
She's like,
I got an email from my parents in Israel. My father was 92 and my mother was 87.
oh my God bless.
About